Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Mike Matthew, and today I'm going to present to you a lesson on the reading and writing connection. Before we begin, I would like to have you please make sure that you have a pencil and paper. Throughout this presentation, I'll ask you several questions, including things about reflection, so that you can go ahead and take notes, and also make sure that you're ready to take a pre-test and a post-test. So please be ready. If you don't have those things, please make sure that you put it on pause and then continue. Okay. Today we're going to focus on two objectives. The first one, we're going to identify the connection between reading and writing. We're also going to identify the difference between early literacy and adolescent literacy. First, let's take a pretest. I want you to answer this question. How is the reading and writing connection achieved? Please take a moment and write down your response. The next question is, what is the difference between early literacy and adolescent literacy? Great, let's begin. Let's first talk about some of the research in the reading and writing connection. Research has demonstrated strong relationships between reading and exposure to text, and higher reading achievement, and between reading and writing ability. Here's a quote about that. Better readers are generally better writers, and better writers are generally better readers. Now, that's something that most people assume, that you would be a good writer and therefore you're a good reader, or maybe you're a good reader and so you'd be a good writer. But oftentimes there are situations where students really would express themselves as having writer's block, although they may be good readers. The question is, why does that happen? Well, if we can as a teacher encourage our students to read and understand what they're reading, then their writing will come naturally. That's an assumption, but let's go and make sure that we understand pretty well what that means. So I want you to go ahead and think about this. Better readers are generally better writers, and better writers are generally better readers. What I want you to do is think about some examples that validates this statement. Just take a second and contemplate that before we move any further in today's presentation. You might want to pause here for a second or two. Okay, let's move on. Here's some of the research regarding the reading and writing connection. Students are more likely to derive learning benefits across reading and writing when they understand that a connection exists. Another example is that writing skill is a predictor of academic success along with reading comprehension. Some more evidence is that reading is the receptive side of knowledge, while writing is the productive side. And one more thing to think about, and that's reading and writing share knowledge of language structure, specifically semantics and syntax. If you're wondering now what is the difference between semantics and syntax, think about it like this. Every time when you ask a student to comprehend or interpret the meaning of the author's message, really what that's about is semantics, making those connections, filling in those gaps, if you will, with the author's intended message. Syntax, on the other hand, is more like structure and grammar, putting all the thoughts together so that it makes sense to the reader, mainly because of the way that the author had decided to write and contain that message in order for the message to be delivered to the audience. Let's now take a second to reflect and respond to this. Think about this a little further. Thoughtfully integrating reading and writing in an instructional program with careful attention paid to the kind of reading and writing tasks assigned. What does that mean? I want you to go ahead and take a second and reflect upon that. Use both your experiences as a teacher, if you are currently teaching in a classroom, or maybe you've encountered as a student. Essentially, what are some reading and writing connection strategies that you have already used in your classroom as a teacher, or that you have encountered again as a student? Choose either one of those and take a second to think about that and reflect and put that in writing. You might want to pause this here for a minute or two. Great. Let's move on. Now let's take a look at the difference between early literacy and adolescent literacy. Now, Here's something that I've experienced as a teacher. One time I was teaching 2nd grade, and my principal wanted me to go ahead and transition into 6th grade. Now, there's a big difference in terms of learning expectations, not just to mention what's happening in the curriculum, but just in terms of how do we go ahead and motivate our students to become both better readers and writers. There's a tremendous difference. If you're a teacher who is more inclined towards little students, the little guys, when we're talking about early childhood expectations, mainly we're talking about one thing in terms of early literacy, and that's phonics. That's the most widely used curriculum. If you're an expert at that and you found your niche, and now you're suddenly faced, as how I was, having to go and teach 6th grade, then you're talking about adolescent literacy. All right, now what's the difference, and how is actually not just a difference, but what is the commonalities or the bridge between phonics and adolescent literacy? So vocabulary is really the emphasis, and that's as close in terms of comparison you're going to get between phonics and the use of phonics in early literacy and adolescent literacy, right? And that's the vocabulary building. Of course, you do have vocabulary building in early literacy, but in terms of looking at the comparison of phonics and vocabulary, essentially you're not going to use phonics in adolescent literacy. It's assumed that in terms of developmental readiness, that the student has already been exposed to certain types of phonics, unless they are in an ELL program, or perhaps they need to make up some of the learning gaps that they've had in their past. But otherwise, it's assumed that vocabulary building is going to be really the crux in terms of the comparison between phonics done in early literacy and then bridging the gap to vocabulary building in adolescent literacy. Phonemic awareness and advanced word study. When we're looking at the two, phonemic awareness is how things sound like, how do you pronounce certain words, and you're building upon, of course, the foundation of the phonics. And when we're looking at vocabulary and advanced word study is really building upon vocabulary, and exercises like advanced word study would be something like having the context clues in an essay, finding out what the word means. You may have some sort of activity where they can do a word search, and then define it, maybe even in their own words, something to really motivate the students, And of course, when we're looking at advanced word study, how are some of those, synonyms are used as well, to expand the vocabulary. That's important too for adolescent. Also, in terms of early literacy, you may want to include some of that as well too. If you have, for example, a student who is advanced, you don't want to necessarily just limit them to certain early literacy works. You might want to just go ahead and see how far along you can advance a student as well. So advanced word study is great specifically for adolescent literacy, but it also could be used for early literacy as well. Comprehension, you're going to find that comprehension is the same. Fluency, and of course you have fluency. Fluency can be defined basically as the ability for a student to read at a certain pace and comprehend it. All right. When they're able to do that, then you know that they're able to pick up, the meanings and the clues of what the authors intended. They're able to explain back to you if you ask them certain questions. That's all related to fluency. Vocabulary, again, something that I've already had mentioned about early literacy. That vocabulary is certainly not to be ignored. You do need to expand the vocabulary of early learners. Now, here is the main difference. When we're talking about motivation, students in early literacy, they are more or less at the foundational stages of developing motivation. So that's not really the point. Motivation is not the point when in terms of early literacy. Really, it's vocabulary building. It's getting them excited about new words. And when you do read alouds, you want to emphasize certain words that they may not have had experienced before. And that builds intrigue. And in essence, it's already inherited in the lesson itself in terms of motivating students at the early stages. But later on, when you're talking about adolescent literacy, oftentimes motivation is really the most important thing that students suffer with. So how do you motivate a student when they are really excellent readers, but in terms of writing, they're not so good at that, or vice versa. In terms of writing, they may love poetry, they may love self-expression, but when it comes to reading, they hardly pick up a book. Okay, my question really, and that's to you as an educator, and that's what are you doing in a classroom to make the connection between reading and writing? So that way they do build up that motivation. They can see how prose is used, if it is poetry, how different types of colloquial expression is used as well. That's important too. Or maybe even just a choice of syntax, to express one's message. All that's very important. And again, it comes from the experience of reading. All right, so you definitely want to build literacy in your classroom, whether it's early or whether it's adolescent. You definitely want to emphasize the importance of reading, and that will eventually headway into the motivation. Let's go take a look at a little bit and some more about what are the different types of activities. How does it look like? For example, making connections. Making connections is, I would like to say, similar to scaffolding, particularly if you're talking about early literacy, connecting to prior experiences, connecting to the real world. All that's really important. And that doesn't stop really just at the early stages. That continues all the way up through even adult education. How it connects to the topic, thesis, and theme, that's also in terms of making connections. But when we're looking at the relationship between reading and writing, making connections, having the students find deeper meaning by building that connection to prior experiences, and then asking a student when they write a topic, how well do they know that topic is, or what motivates them to write that topic. That really gets them to think about how well they connect to the topic, how well they connect to the theme, why they're choosing that theme. All that comes from, again, the background in making connections. Self-questioning. That's linked to the writing process, organization, and drafts. Self-questioning is not just reflection. Reflection alone doesn't really serve a tremendous purpose, not unless you're going to ask the really important questions such as, how do I know that I know? Or how do you know that you know? All that leads to the writing process, okay, and leads to the kind of choice that you want the students to partake in. If the choice is going to be like a free writing process, then they might be looking at things that's more or less experiential, or things that even in terms of if it's a fiction writing, some of that other techniques like visualization and all of that also lends itself to the writing process. So you're going to see how that works in terms of connection between the reading and writing. I just mentioned visualization. When we talk about visualization and reading, mainly as a technique, this is where you want your students to close their eyes, especially the early, the early literacy, group. Have them close their eyes, do a read aloud, and as they listen to your voice and you take them on that journey, they're able to conceptualize what it is that the author is saying. In the same respect, though, when you're engaging in the writing process, it's similar to visualization because they're creating a schemata. They're creating a visual that is going to enable them to process their topic and perhaps help out with that organization before they engage in the actual writing of the document itself. Determining importance. And of course, supporting details, use of evidence, use of examples. When we read literature, we have to firstly ask ourselves, what's the point of this? It's so important, especially in today's times when we read literature from all across sources of fields. Like, for example, you may have the internet, in their media, and they are advocating certain ideas. Well, a student must understand that not every idea is a great one. So evidence must be supported in that case. Okay, why is it that this thing is being reported? That's a really good question to ask. Who are the audience? What is the purpose behind that? So determining the importance as a good reader, that leads into the kind of inquiry that will enable them to become better writers, because it's not just good enough if you're doing expository writing that you're just going to simply state an opinion. It's more or less, why is it that you feel that way? That's important, but what are the supporting details? What's your evidence? If you have read a book and you are supporting your interpretation of the author's message, where in that book are you going to justify your responses in order for your paper to make sense, in order for your ideas to really make sense? Using examples is a really good indicator that the student has thought through this process, and able to demonstrate with supporting details. You might want to look at that very, very closely, especially if you're an IB teacher. That's International Baccalaureate teacher. Okay, let's move on. Some more connections, making an inference. How that's connected to writing is the audience, reader's concerns, counter arguments. This is where you say to your students, if they're writing, I want you to imagine from your audience perspective how that sounds like. Or you might even want to say straightforwardly to your students, who is your audience? Okay, who you're writing for, and then that would allow them to better structure their essay. Making an inference. Why is the author writing in this manner? Who is the author's audience? For what purpose is he writing this piece? That's important too, because inherent in the reading is a model for them to use to make an inference. And if you can identify a piece of literature that your students really enjoy, this is an area of opportunity for you to really explore for them, so that they can use this as an example in their own writing in terms of what makes it interesting for the audience. Okay, what are their concerns and counter arguments, etc. Synthesis is a huge area of concern for most folks. And this is where you want to identify really good pieces where the author writes fluently and able to synthesize more than one idea, but yet not losing focus on the topic. This is where research, you might want to include other elements in there, connect different ideas, but again, you're not losing sight of your topic. For those of you who are considering a doctorate, for example, this is where, as an adult learner, to synthesize information becomes a real challenge in terms of the writing process. When someone asks of you, what is a research topic, and you're able to explain it, then how are you synthesizing other literature to support your topic? And again, to support your topic, what types of research and how you're going to measure that study, that will allow you to carry forward, in your dissertation topic. So synthesis is highly important. And when we're talking about synthesizing information at an early age, mainly it's scaffolding, making sense of experience. As a student develops later on, we're talking more so about how to use research skills and developing their ideas, so that way they can really make sense of what they're thinking of and how to put that in writing. Okay, and again, don't forget to use lots of examples in literature in order to model this for your students. Comprehension. We're talking about diction, syntax, cohesiveness, and flow. Oftentimes we have students who they're really good readers, and if they're not interpreting right, or if they don't answer your questions correctly, then have them go back and reread it. Make sure that they're comprehending, because that's going to affect later on their ability to synthesize their own thoughts and to make it so that it's cohesive enough so when they write it, it makes sense. So the fluidity, or how it flows from the first topic in that paragraph, the very first introductory paragraph, all the way up through the summary, the very last summary. How does that flow from point A all the way down to point Z? if you will. Okay, all of that is structure, all of that is syntax. This is what most students get discouraged on. It's the boring stuff. But again, if we have some literature that the students can refer to, then that will be a good model for them to use, and therefore they would have something solid to refer to. Okay, so it's always a good idea when you start a writing assignment, use a piece of literature that the students can refer to as an example. Now we're ready for a post-test. There was a lot of information that was shared with you through today's presentation about the reading and writing connection. I want you now to go ahead and take a look at your notes, particularly some of those reflection pieces, and to revisit also your pre-tests. They're the same questions. The first question: how is the reading and writing connection achieved? Think about the things that we discussed in today's presentation and take a minute or two and answer that. Great. The next question: what is the difference between early literacy and adolescent literacy? Awesome. Now that we've covered in today's presentation the connection between reading and writing, just know there's more information out there. There's more studies to cover. Some of the references that I have in here, it's not comprehensive, but generally speaking, it's solid. Okay, so just make sure that you can, if you want to refer to this, keep in mind that I want you to continue the research, to continue looking deeply into the connection of reading and writing. If you have any further questions about the connection, don't hesitate to give me a call or to email me, drmikematthew@gmail.com. Thank you so much for today's presentation, and I hope to hear from you soon if indeed you have any further questions. Goodbye.